I grew up with hippie parents. They had a desire for me to have a connection to and an understanding of the world around me. The way that this showed up for me largely was that I spent much of my life studying problems. When I was about 10 years old, I started working for Greenpeace doing door-to-door fundraising. And in my time there, I got to learn about problems of overfishing of the oceans and improper dumping of nuclear waste. A couple years later, I started working with the Human Rights Campaign and got to learn about issues of discrimination and of social injustice. And as time went on, I continued to study more and bigger issues, particularly existential issues, the kind that, if we didn't reverse them within a pretty short period of time, would move our world in the direction of becoming uninhabitable for most of life. The more that I spent time learning about the problems facing the planet, the more that I felt compelled to do something to be able to affect change. So I started launching every possible campaign that I could to try to work on all of the issues. I started running Feed the Homeless programs and doing house build projects in Mexico. Got involved in natural disaster relief efforts. Over time, I ended up moving into doing things like working on judicial reform and drug policy reform. Started writing new pieces of legislation. But the deeper that I got into the experience of working on the problems, I started to have this really sort of bittersweet experience with it. Because on one side, I got to come face to face with the people whose lives were being affected by the work that we were doing. And I got to see how their quality of life was improving and could see the smiles on their faces. And some of those experiences were some of the more beautiful and touching experiences that I've ever had the opportunity to have. But at the same time that I was having those experiences, I would look back at the work that had been done over the last few years, and I was struck by the realization that it wasn't enough. And it wasn't just that what I was doing wasn't enough. It was that when I looked at everything, I looked at the 3 million plus nonprofits around the world, and I looked at all the individuals and the groups that were coming together to work on problems, I realized that all of it combined wasn't enough. The number of problems facing the planet, the scale of the problems, and just the amount of inertia behind them was such that we weren't able to address them within enough time to be able to have us no longer basically like sprinting towards our own collapse as a society. So as I had this realization, I had to step back a little bit and try to take a look at things from a different angle. And specifically, I dove into the inquiry around, was there something underlying? Was there some kind of causation that allowed these problems to exist and that allowed them to proliferate, where if we could understand what was underlying and we could be able to affect change at that level, that we might be able to make the necessary impact within the necessary time frame. So the more time that I spent with this inquiry, I actually did come to a sense of clarity around what was underlying. Before I share that with you, though, let me share something that I think is important for context. If you take time and you look at all the biggest problems facing the world, right? You study ocean acidification and topsoil depletion and global warming, what you find is that we actually know a lot about them. And not just in terms of what kinds of causes are behind them or how far progressed they are, but specifically, we know a lot about what's required to reverse them, right? To be able to move us away from a potentially very bleak future and into a future of sustainability. And for each of the major problems, there have been either government or NGO studies that have shown what would be the technological needs to reverse them, what would the time be, and what would the cost be to be able to make these changes. Give an example. The United Nations did a comprehensive study on global hunger, and they came out and said it would cost about $30 billion a year to be able to address global hunger such that every single person on the planet had enough food to eat ongoingly and sustainably. Now, if you take that and all the other problems that have essentially a budget attached to what is required to address them, and you put all those together and you add up all those budgets, what you find is that cumulative total is less than the amount of money that we spend every single year on military. Let that sink in. I want you to get what that actually means, right? We have, as a society, the ability today, not 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, or a generation from now when our technology is more advanced, but today, we have the ability, both technologically and financially, to be able to address all the problems facing the world and to move us away from unnecessary suffering and into a world of sustainability and potentially even one that supports a thriving of all of life. And yet we're not doing it. And instead, we're spending that money on going to battle with one another. So this illustrates the underlying problem, which is that as a society, as a culture, we believe that we're separate. And that as a result of being separate, that it's possible for us to advantage ourselves at the expense of other life. Right? So it's this belief that we're separate and that we can make our own quality of life better regardless of its impact on others that allow us as an individual to walk into a store and see two very similar products, but choose to buy the less expensive one, even though we know the cheaper company treats its employees abusively. It's the same belief of separation that allows us as a society to celebrate corporations for the maximum amount of profit that they can create in a quarter for their investors, even though the way they're doing it is causing massive amounts of environmental harm. You see, we have a problem, which is that we are simultaneously incentivizing the very things that we're wanting to change. We want to be able to see a world that moves towards sustainability, that supports life, and yet we're incentivizing individuals and companies to do the things that are causing the very harm that we want to see shift. So it's from this idea of separation is one that has been around for a long time. And the thing is that for most of human history, it wasn't a problem in the way that it currently is. Right? If we go back even just a few hundred years, the world only had about 500 million people in it. And we didn't have the technological capacity to be able to affect so much change so quickly. Right? Back in the days of villages, if there was a neighboring village that had a resource that I wanted, and they weren't willing to give it up readily, I could get together with my village buddies, and we could build some spears and some bows and arrows, and we could go and attack and kill them and take their stuff. And could bring it back to our village, and we would now have more stuff. And we would get to have a better quality of life with relatively little sense of ongoing repercussion. But we don't live in that world now. Right now, we live in a world with 7.5 billion people in it, where we use up natural resources more quickly than the world can reproduce them with the current way we live. And we have the kinds of technology where we can affect massive amounts of change instantly. Right? When we now want to go to battle, we're not doing it with spears. We're not doing it with bows and arrows. We're doing it with ICBMs and with nuclear bombs that are designed to be able to end all of life. So, where the idea of separation didn't used to pose an existential threat to our existence, it now does. And what's necessary going forward is for us to change that underlying belief system, that underlying value system, away from separation and instead into a recognition of the profound and inextricable connectedness of all of life. For us to recognize that what's best for us as an individual, for our families, for our communities, is fundamentally what's best for the world at large. And that what's best for the world at large ultimately is what's best for us as individuals and for our own quality of life. From this recognition, it becomes important that we start to align our own personal needs and desires with the needs and desires of the whole. Now, I know that we've all heard something like this before, right? Everybody's heard a talk that says we're all connected, we're all one. And I think at a philosophical level, everyone appreciates the idea, but sees it as just that, an idea, not a tangible reality. In many ways, I think people see it as too Pollyanna or maybe even a little bit woo-woo. But regardless, when we look at what seems to motivate the human population, people tend to not think that it's possible for a world, for a whole society to come together from a place of connectedness with a motivation for the efforts that we do to be good for the greater whole. But not only is it doable, it's necessary for the survival of the human race. And there's a tool that actually makes this change relatively simple. And that tool is empathy. The ability for us to feel what somebody else feels. For us to experience what someone else experiences as though it is our own. Now, people don't actually use the word empathy very often. And as a result, it's oftentimes misunderstood or used synonymously with things like caring. Now, caring is a beautiful quality. Right? It's one I want to see a lot more of in the world. And yet, caring is something that can still happen from a place of separation. You can be sitting at home and you can watch a television show and you can see a video of a starving child in another country. And you can see the suffering on their face and you can care about them. But it's such that you can care about them, with them still being a separate entity. And as a result of that separation still being there, if what you see is too painful, or if it seems too overwhelming because you don't feel like you know what to do to be able to change it, or if you're just too busy, right, and it's inconvenient, you can shut it off. And you can just go on with your daily life. Empathy is distinctly different from this. Empathy is where you actually step out of your own experience, your own reference frame, even if just for a moment, and allow yourself to fully drop into the experience of another life, to feel what they feel as though it's your own experience. Now, what's particularly beautiful about empathy is that when you can truly empathize with someone, from that place it becomes almost impossible for us to not feel a sense of motivation to do something, to be able to affect their quality of life. If enough of us, if a critical mass of people were to come together and choose to prioritize empathy on a daily basis, make it a daily part of our life, each day allow ourselves to tune in just a little bit more. Each day allow ourselves to become aware of the world around us just a little bit more, and to feel just a little bit more. What ends up happening is that within each of us arises what it is that is uniquely ours to do, what is our unique contribution to the world. And that ultimately is what's going to create the necessary change. It's not going to be the technology or the science or the infrastructure. Now, they're going to be important, right? Some of the problems are vast, they're complex, they're going to require technological solutions. But we can't address them just at the level of the problem and just with technology alone. We have to address them by fundamentally shifting that underlying value system. And that world, that one where we choose to step away from separation and from greed and to step into connectedness and to allow ourselves to be motivated to do what is in the greater good of everyone, and to do so through tuning in by empathy, that world, that's the one I want to live in. It's the one I'm committed to helping to create. And I hope that you'll join me in that vision. Thank you.